you very much. We've heard amazing stories about women from around the world. This morning we're going to talk in this segment about animals, but we're also going to talk about people. The illegal wildlife trade is the fourth largest global illegal trade after drugs, arms, and human trafficking in the world. These three statistics: 35,000 elephants are killed every year, 3 rhinos are killed every day, there are more tigers in backyards here in America than there are in the wild. Astonishing. It's an epidemic. Stopping it is urgent. I'm joined here on the stage to talk about this and to answer some of these questions with Dr. Paula Kahumbu. She's the CEO of Kenya's Wildlife Direct. Mélanie Gouby, investigative journalist who was featured in that documentary you just saw, Virunga. And Kate Brooks, who's an acclaimed photojournalist and filmmaker of the upcoming documentary, The Last Animals. We'll see a second of it in a minute. Thank you very much and welcome all three of you.
Thank you.
Paula, let me start with you. There was a poaching epidemic back in the 1980s, and then it seemed to go into decline. What happened since then? Why have we suddenly seen a huge rise, some of those statistics we pointed out there, in the number of animals, and particularly of elephants, being killed?
Well, in the 1980s, the poaching epidemic was driven by demand for ivory, primarily in the West, Europe, the US, and Japan. Kenya and many African countries took the initiative of destroying ivory to send a world message that these animals are worth more alive. And that message translated into decisions that banned the international trade in ivory. The prices collapsed. The business of trafficking in ivory just dried up. But in 2002, a one-off sale of ivory took place to Japan from 4 southern African countries. In 2008, a second one-off sale took place. It was endorsed by the world's countries at the CITES Convention. And that triggered an explosion of demand because the sale was to China. You can imagine a country where ivory is believed to be precious, to confer prestige on the owners of it. The price of ivory tripled in just 3 or 4 years, which means that the price of ivory was doubling every year. So people started buying ivory as an asset, to speculate on future values. This just resulted in an epidemic of poaching across the entire continent, and this is fueled by corruption in Africa. So we saw this in Kenya, and it's just devastating elephants across the entire continent.
Paula, you have a PhD in elephant ecology. I didn't know it was possible to have a PhD in elephant ecology. It sounds like we need more people like you, but it's
Absolutely.
Not just elephants, of course. Rhinos as well, 3 a day being killed. And by some estimates, rhino horn is valued at $60,000 a pound. That makes it more expensive than both gold and cocaine. What's driving the demand there?
So the rhino horn demand is also driven by Asia, primarily Vietnam, where rhino horn is ground up and it's considered to have special potencies, which include cleaning your blood, getting rid of a headache. If you use it, you sprinkle it on your food every day, it could prevent you from getting cancer. It's all bogus. It's probably myths that have been generated by traffickers themselves. The rarer rhinos become, the more valuable the horns become. And even though most of the rhino horn out there, it's equivalent to your fingernails, right? It's made from keratin. It's hair, fingernails. It has absolutely no real medical value whatsoever. But the fact that there is this myth that it can cure you of cancer. Imagine you're a parent in Vietnam. Your child is dying. Every other option has not worked. You'll spend any amount of money to try and save that child. So this myth is resulting in the decimation of rhinos, and particularly South Africa, where they're losing 3 per day.
Kate, we said at the beginning, this is not just about animals, of course, it's about people as well. You are a conflict photographer. You've covered Afghanistan and the Middle East since the attacks of 9/11, and then you switched to working in the conservation field in Africa and looking at the poaching epidemic as a war zone. Why have we seen this spike in violence around poaching and around the poaching epidemic?
Well, I would say the front lines of this issue are definitely as deadly as any war that I have covered. And in one particular park where I've spent a lot of time, to put it into perspective, you have the Lord's Resistance Army operating in the park. You have various Sudanese rebel factions, including the SPLA, pillaging and plundering the natural resources of the park. And you've also had multiple military helicopter incursions into the park whereby elephants are machine gunned down by helicopter. So it is...
You have not just animals being killed, you've got poachers being killed, you've got rangers being killed, and you've got militia involved in this as well.
Yes, and the rangers who are there put their lives on the line every single day going out to protect the elephants that are there. And you know, I'm not exactly a dinosaur, and when I was born, there were 22,000 elephants in Gouby National Park and 500 rhinos. Today, there are 0 rhinos, there are 1,300 elephants, and there are more militia in the park than giraffe.
Okay, the numbers are staggering. Let's get a look at your upcoming documentary. It's coming out soon, The Last Animals. Let's take a look at this clip. It's really hard to watch. That poacher is a boy, and he's badly wounded. How often does something like that happen? How often are they that young?
Well, this is Monday morning in the park, and this was a group of poachers. They were related, so the 2 captured in this incident both survived. But the use of child soldiers is not an uncommon phenomenon in Africa. And what I would say is that it's a free-for-all in the park. Most of the poaching going on in Gouby is organized. It's not opportunistic poaching that's happening. And they're armed, and rangers are getting shot at by the poachers who are in the park.
Mélanie, you also work as a documentary maker, and you're working in this field. You've done a film that shows the attempts of Soko Oil Company to explore for oil in Virunga National Park. It was documented in your film, Virunga. We saw a little bit at the beginning. How is the company, in that case, exploiting the environment and indeed the local Congolese party for their people for their own financial gain?
Well, so Soko International came to Eastern Congo to explore in Virunga National Park, which is the oldest national park in Africa. And they started promising people living in and around the park that they would get jobs, that they will benefit from the oil exploration, so that they could gain access to the lake and the park. And obviously the park is protected by international law. It's a World Heritage Site. So to be able to gain access to that park, they had to convince the park rangers that it would be beneficial for them also to let them explore, because the ranger's job is to protect that park.
And during the filming of this documentary, war broke out between the rebel army and the Congo military. Your investigation uncovered links between Soko Company's executives, rebel militias, key political players, and even rangers in the park who were being bribed themselves. Let's take a look at a clip from this movie of Mélanie wearing a hidden camera who was recording a conversation between a Soko executive and a Soko subcontractor.
I never spoke to a fucking rebel myself. That's why we subcontract that shit.
Who's paying the fucking money? You or them?
Subcontracted.
No, you can't get away with that.
Doesn't matter where the money comes from.
Of course it does. Without the money, the job doesn't happen. Fucking civilians don't get killed. You don't have war. It's the money that fuels everything. So to give them money and then turn around and say it's nothing to do with us, it's just fucking hypocritical. You know, it's just plain God.
But if
you're going to do it, at least be fucking honest about it.
No,
It's business, and business is business.
It sounds almost like a script from a bad thriller. And if you didn't know it was actually real and that you had actually filmed it, you wouldn't quite believe that this level of cynicism was happening. We should give you the response from SOCO, of course. They have the right to reply, and this is their written response to the film. It's up there on the screen, you can see it there. They, of course, they denied your allegations and what you'd found in the film, but what happened after the film came out, Mélanie?
Well, so they've denied, obviously, but a number of their shareholders didn't think that was enough. Their shareholders spanned banks, Norwegian pension fund, the Church of England, and they were very shocked by what the film showed. So they've started asking questions and demanding that SOCO investigate what their agent had been doing on the ground. And a number of their shareholders have now divested from SOCO International, and in September 2015, the company didn't renew its license to Block 5, which is the block that it's on Virunga. So they're gone.
Which shows that things can change when we take action and when a spotlight is shone on this problem. But Paula, Mélanie's film prevented one incident of environmental rape in Africa.
Right.
This is a continent-wide epidemic. You have described it, I think, as a low-risk, high-reward phenomenon. Why is it so difficult to tackle?
Well, you know, it's a very complex issue. We're living in a globalized world. You know, you have demand in China. You have all these transit countries through which wildlife products are being shipped through. We have countries in Africa that are on the rise, like Kenya, like South Africa, where business, almost anything will be sacrificed for business interests, for development interests. And this is all in this, you know, environment or matrix of corruption. You can buy off almost anybody, right? This is what has happened because of the rapid rate of development in Africa.
But the world has tackled it before. We did tackle this in the 1980s, as you started
Yes, we
by
did.
saying. Yeah, Kate.
The world was very different at that time, though.
Well, and I think one thing that's really important to spotlight is while there was the international trade ban, which the international community essentially partially disbanded by allowing these quote-unquote one-off sales, domestic markets around the world for ivory have continued to operate. And so there's an international trade ban, but legal markets, and of course those legal markets are being fed but with blood ivory. So, you know, for this to really end, we need all markets to actually be closed.
When I lived in Zimbabwe, which was a long time ago, back in the late 1980s, I feel like we were having the same conversation.
Yeah.
We were talking about the need to provide alternatives. If we were going to stop young boys, like the poacher we saw in your film, Kate, if we were going to stop people from poaching elephants, we had to give them something else. Has that happened, Paula? Has there been an alternative provided for people?
So
some kind of vested interest in keeping animals alive?
Different countries have different approaches. In Kenya, of course, tourism is a phenomenal way that the government generates revenue, and so the national parks and wildlife has a special status. You can't say the same for Congo, where very few tourists would even dream of going into the parks in the Congo, in places where it could be quite dangerous. In parts of Kenya where you have similar levels of insecurity, where you won't get tourists, we do have phenomenal showcases of success, like in the northern part of Kenya. This is a semi-arid area. It is infiltrated with people with weapons who could turn those weapons against every elephant if they wanted to. But the long-term work of people on the ground, the real dedicated commitment, for example, the Northern Rangelands Trust and Ian Craig, the work they've done is to build a future that people can visualize, that is a successful future that they can believe in, that depends on them taking care of their resources today. Even though they're not rich, they're poor, and they're suffering today, people are willing, amazingly willing, to take sacrifices, to make sacrifices, and to work hard. because they believe in that future. So there are examples and there are models. It is not happening across the continent, and it's not happening fast enough. And it's because the development agenda in many African countries is completely delinked from the environmental programs and the conservation and tourism interests as well.
Mélanie, you've seen this firsthand. You went into the bush with pangolin poachers in Cameroon. What are the conditions like for poachers there, and what are the kind of level of what's the kind of level of poverty we're talking about?
Well, it was very interesting because it's a park in Cameroon, and it's on its border. There is a town where everyone is linked to poaching. Everyone survives thanks to poaching. There is nothing else, and people don't have an alternative.
No agriculture, no other industry.
No, there is nothing. It's the jungle. There is a bit of trading, but it's very minimal. And everyone who does something else than poaching has clients because there is money thanks to poaching. So everything is kind of turned around that. So people really have no choice. And meanwhile, you see big trucks or a tree trunk from a logging company that are given concession by the government. They're foreign companies, obviously, and they employ only foreigners. So for the local people who see these foreigners coming with the permission of their government, making a lot of money from the environment, and then they're denied the right to make money from their environment as well because poaching, or like hunting, as they say, is illegal. It's absolutely unfair. Why would they not benefit from their own resources while the government allows foreigners to do that?
Mélanie, you're an eye who's watching this from the outside. Do you think poverty is an excuse for poaching?
If you don't have food to put on your table at night for your children, I don't think anything else matters, So that's the way it is. People are desperately poor in a lot of these places. That was also very visible in Eastern Congo, where the main threat to the Virunga National Park, now that the oil company is gone, is back to deforestation, and deforestation is done by the local population that doesn't have an alternative to cook, to heat their homes, so they cut down trees and use the wood to do that.
Kate, let me put the same question to you.
I think that impoverished communities get exploited, frankly, by criminal networks. I mean, they're really the ones who are making the big money off of this. Poachers,
it's not the poacher we saw in your
they're
film.
Basically, they're foot soldiers, and that the wildlife trafficking now is incredibly well organized, which is why forensic work is becoming so important, because it's now possible to with an ivory seizure, do DNA testing on it, trace the ivory back to the killing fields of the source population, and to be able to say that this ivory came from this country, even down to the national park. And the shipments, you're talking about containers and containers. Sometimes in October, I was in Singapore photographing and filming a seizure that was 4.6 tons of ivory that was intercepted.
Amazing. Going
from Mombasa to Singapore. But the reality is that ivory isn't from Kenya. And so the DNA work becomes really important. And over time, DNA work and forensic work is now being used to track criminal networks.
That's one thing that needs to happen. Clearly, the forensics and the DNA work are getting more sophisticated. I mean, as the poachers get more sophisticated, we have to get more sophisticated in our investigations as well. But Paula, what do you do to try to make Africans feel that wildlife is a heritage worth saving, rather than as some, understandably, and I saw this myself in Zimbabwe, if an elephant's just trampled your crops, you don't care about that. You want to get rid of that elephant. Your crops matter to you more than that elephant does.
So that's a really big issue for me as an African in a continent where a lot of people say, well, those animals are there for foreigners. At the end of this month, Kenya is going to destroy 105 tons of ivory, 1.5 tons of rhino horns, which have been seized in the seizures that Kate has just mentioned. That's worth over $1 billion. We're not a rich country. We're going to destroy $1 billion worth of wildlife products to make a statement. These animals are worth more alive. And the tragedy is that to many people, they do live in the land with these animals. The animals do cause all kinds of conflicts. But as Africans, we have a very, very strong, ancient connection to wildlife.
Do people feel that? Because
Many
you
people
go
do.
around wildlife safaris and stuff, and it's nearly all white tourists.
Yes, it is. Because we turned our parks into places to generate money, and the people who will pay are tourists.
Right.
So we're turning this around. You know, Kenya Wildlife Service is going through a major change in the country, and we've started, for the very first time, a television series in Kenya that's on wildlife. We've never had wildlife programming. Can you imagine that more Americans and Europeans have seen and know African animals by name? They know the individual lions of a Masai Mara, and they know the names of elephants in Amboseli. And in Kenya, we don't. And these films are sometimes 30 years old, and they've never been shown in Africa. So we've started a program of showcasing these films as an experiment. The impact is phenomenal. It's one of the top-rating films, television films during the week. What I'm saying is that there is this innate interest and love for wildlife. And just last week, a very tragic incident happened. A lion was killed, which had just injured somebody outside of the national park. Now, previously, if a lion injures somebody, that lion needs to be destroyed. That was the decision of the park service. The city of Nairobi was up in arms. How could you kill a lion? These animals are so important to us. This is just after 2 months of programming about wildlife.
Right.
So I do think
So public opinion can change.
Public opinion can change like this. It's very, very quick. People do love animals. We know that. That's why people go to the zoos here in the United States. Animals and humans, we have a special connection to animals. And we may not ever be able to explain it, but it only takes spending time with animals, going into the parks, meeting elephants and lions, and knowing them as individuals, not just as another animal.
And we should be clear, we will lose them within a generation if we don't do something about this. Mélanie, you've seen one project that has worked as an alternative. Tell us about the hydropower project in Virunga National Park and how that is giving an alternative.
Well, so that's for me the crucial reason why Virunga is so important is it's addressing this problem that people don't have an alternative. So people deforest because they need energy to heat their home. So the park instead has built a number of hydropower plants around the park using the park resource, which is, the park is very mountainous, so you have very strong river with a very strong flow, and so that can generate a lot of electricity. And so they've made these hydropower plants to provide electricity for people living around the park so that they have an alternative, that they don't have to cut trees, but also they can develop, they can read at night, and that helps education for children, that they walk lit streets at night, so security is increased, that hospitals have electricity, they can buy incubators and save lives, and so it's changed part of the region for the better.
I think another thing that we can all do is recognize that this is not just an African or an Asian issue. I said at the beginning, there are more tigers in backyards here in the United States than there are in the wild. Kate, talk to us about that, about the image of trophy heads, and we're going to put it up on the screen, that you've photographed at the Wildlife Repository.
There was a photograph that was... This is a photograph that was taken at the Denver Repository in November 2013 when the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service destroyed the ivory stockpiles that they had seized. And it's a warehouse full of millions of wildlife products. And the reality is the United States is the second largest consumer of wildlife products in the world after China. And one of the interesting things, when I was talking about referencing the ivory ban, there's only one state right now in all of the United States where there is a total ban on ivory and rhino horn, and that's New Jersey. And And 3 other states have tightened regulations, so New York, California, and Washington State. And there's a movement, but there's a lot of opposition to it. And what do you find when you get into these issues is that criminal networks exploit every single legal loophole. So less than a month ago, Beverly Hills auctioneer pleaded guilty to trafficking $1 million of ivory and rhino horn. And how he did it was by falsifying documents, because the federal law is that ivory before 1976 can be bought and sold. But the reality of it is that it's very difficult to differentiate. The only way to really know is by doing isotope testing, and wildlife traffickers exploit this all of the time.
So we need to change the laws, otherwise we get pictures like the ones we have just seen. Very briefly, Paula, what's the one thing you would like to see done over the next year?
Well, the only way to deal with this crisis is going to be a global response. I would love to see the ban on domestic markets of ivory and pangolins, rhino horn, all these products, not only in the United States, across the United States, across all of the Asian countries, but starting with China. China consumes about 90% of the world's ivory, so they really are the nub of the problem. And I think if China takes that action, I think the rest of Asia will also fall in line.
Paula, Kahumbu, Kate Brooks, Mélanie, Gouby, thank you very much for joining us, our environmental warriors. Thank you.